This episode of the Golf Guru Show is sponsored by enveedhemp.com. That's ENVEED hemp.com. I'm happy to say that Enveed has been my choice for my CBD needs for almost 3 years now, and I can't begin to tell you how it's improved my life. They come in 3 formulas: Clarity, Relief, and Relax. I typically take a Clarity drop in the morning with my coffee to get me focused and ready to go for the day. Some relief for my aches and pains or inflammation after a run or a workout. And then I do a drop of Relax before I go to bed that helps me get some of the best sleep that I've had in years. And my Whoop Band now tells me that it's definitely helping because my recovery scores have been higher than ever. Enveed Hemp CBD come in drops, roll-ons, and gummies, so you can take it however you choose. So go to enveedhemp.com and make sure you use the Guru code GURU20 for a 20% discount for life. You heard it right, 20% discount for life. CBD is a great supplement to keep you healthy and safe in these crazy times. So go get it. So let's get to today's episode.
It's not what you know, it's what you can prove.
You know how to cut to the core of me, Baxter. You're so wise. You're like a miniature Buddha covered in hair.
I want to become a guru so girls will like me. Then I will like myself.
Now, before we do this, let's go over the ground rules. Rule number 1. No touching of the hair or face.
Of course.
And that's it! Now let's do this!
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Golf Guru Show. I am your host, Jason Sutton, Director of Instruction at the beautiful Colleton River Club in Bluffton, South Carolina. I'm so very grateful that you have joined me. As my guest today is Dr. Mark Bull. This is Dr. Bull's second appearance on the show. You can find his first appearance at episode number 108, which was an awesome conversation, but we had only scratched the surface with the topics and questions that we were able to get to, so I had to have him back on again. And did he ever deliver in a massive way? For those of you that don't know, Dr. Bull is one of the world's most sought after 3D and motion specialists. Dr. Bull has a PhD in sport, exercise, and rehabilitation science, and also is a fully qualified PGA coach. Mark founded Mark Bull Golf, and now Bull 3D in 2009, and continues to develop and evolve his software, education, and philosophies, allowing him to provide the leading 3D, biomechanical, and sports sciences services available in golf. If you haven't subscribed to his subscription-based website, bull3dacademy.com, then you are falling behind. It is one of the most visited golf instruction sites in the world. He has a great follow on Instagram as well, so give him a follow at Bull3D Academy. Notable players that he has worked with and been associated with other coaches would include Justin Rose, Danny Willett, Francesco Molinari, Johnny Vegas, Oliver Fisher, and many others that I'm sure this list has grown, but he doesn't advertise the many great players that he's worked with or consulted with other coaches. In a nutshell, Dr. Bull is one of the smartest minds in our golf industry, and I just admire his honesty, humility, and willingness to help others and share information with other coaches, which is why I think we get along so well. And I just admire him immensely. I won't bore you any longer with this long intro because I'm excited and honored to share this amazing conversation with my friend, Dr. Mark Bull. Enjoy. So welcome back to the show. Dr. Bull, it's a pleasure to have you back. I've been just so excited to get back with you and to spend some time with you and see how you've been doing and what you've been up to. So thanks so much for taking the time.
Hey, my pleasure, Jason. Thank you so much for the invitation again. It's a real delight to speak with you. And I can't believe it's been 13 months since you and I last spoke. We were in Florida, and a lot's changed, since then, which is life, I guess. So it's great to see you, great to be back, and very excited to talk with you this evening.
Yeah, I know you're back in London now, so you're finally able to travel.
Yes. I mean, it was the embassy's been shut since March 2020, I think it is. So it's approaching now 18 months. And we were very lucky that when I had an email come through from the embassy saying your visa renewal was scheduled for February 22. I was like, oh, you're kidding me. But, what can you do? You can't shout to anybody, but you get one chance to kind of put your case as to why we'd like to come back to the US sooner than that. So I kind of put the case in, and they came back with September I think the 10th was my date. So I was very lucky to kind of get it escalated, which is good. So as you and I record, I think, I'll be back on Monday in Orlando. So
Nice.
Really excited to get back, and it's just getting cold in London now, so it's kind of come at a good time. So yeah, it's just getting a little chilly here.
Yeah, we're finally getting a little bit of fall weather, even down here in the low countries. Starting to cool down a little bit, which is nice. It's not a 95 and 100% humidity.
Yeah, well, you can avert those numbers. It's 59 in London, so there you go.
Oh my.
Yeah, it's a little chilly today, but it's cool. It's what keeps us kind of doing what we do, so no stress.
That's right. So I'd like to start in a place, and again, we can go in many different directions. I've got tons of notes and obviously done a lot of research, but I want to start with types of coaching, right? So sort of, if we had to throw a blanket statement out as far as like the two types of coaching, one would be like information-based versus ecological dynamics, or the more exploration type, right? Or what a lot of people call constraints-led approach. Can you speak on that? First, maybe tell the listeners that maybe aren't aware, which my listeners are pretty educated, but the two differences, and then we can sort of go into, I think, the advantages and disadvantages of each style.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's actually more approaches than just those two, but they're almost the scale in some ways of kind of how people would define, how players learn and evolve. So, historically, when you say look at golf coaching, you look at, say, historical coaching, in essence, the coach would say, provide feedback, give very explicit commands, for example, reference body segments, references, positions, words like you need, and this is kind of how you have to move, and this is what good players do. Really kind of explicit, very, as you say, constrained in many ways, kind of references the players then get exposed to. So in essence, it's kind of, in some ways, kind of teeter tails kind of student does would be the very kind of crude way of defining that, where the more, and that's called information processing within kind of learning. Then you have the opposite part of that scale being ecological dynamics, which is very much the environment provides the answers. So one of my kind of many philosophies, as I'm sure you're aware from last time you and I spoke, was there's a lot of movement you can't do in life when asked the right question. So unless you are born with a condition or constraint, for example, there's not a single movement that humans can't do when asked the right question. So what a ecological dynamics approach would encourage is through exploration, through much more implicit, almost extracting the answer, guiding the human to find their answer, which in some ways is kind of what I kind of say to most players, is about finding your answer, not mine. What it means to Jason will be very, very different to what it means to Mark. But in essence, you're kind of right or wrong is a very bad word to use within life. But define right or wrong, that's a whole different kind of podcast. And what's kind of right for you could be very, very poor for me. So what those kind of coaches would kind of look at is through the environment, through much more task demands, much more implicit based learning, much more guidance. For example, this is how you could move rather than this is how you should move, which almost be kind of could and should in some ways, would be kind of a playful way of almost kind of defining ecological dynamics versus information processing. The very historical, almost kind of didactic coaches, this is what you should do because this is what good players do. Well, okay, that's a pretty big claim to make. This is what some established players do. It's like research. For every paper it says that, I'll find you two it says this. That's the basis of research. So then the ecological dynamics is much more around through the environment, through play, through feedback, through discussion, in a very kind of clean language in some ways. In many ways you kind of speak by saying nothing. You kind of say nothing by speaking, so you say lots of words but actually say nothing in some ways. Would almost then kind of guide that player to kind of almost arrive at their answer would be the kind of way of seeing that. Now, it's interesting you mentioned advantages and disadvantages. It very much goes back to, again, just to expand on that, something I kind of call responders and non-responders. It's understanding and establishing what players and coaches, by the way, what they respond to and what they don't respond to. So what approach does player A respond to can be very, very different to player B. And neither approaches are bad. It very much connects back to, in some ways, the question you're trying to solve. So, you and I spoke off camera there about one of your players currently has a condition. So it's understanding, for example, what exactly are you attempting to resolve in the session? And this is where I think within coaching, certainly when you look at just say social media, for example, it's so solution based, solution. Now, you cannot employ a solution unless you really understand the problem you're trying to solve. So until you fully understand what is it exactly you are attempting to resolve or improve or move away from or adjust for this player, then you really can't employ a solution. So what invariably most players or most coaches do is go, we'll try multiple solutions with the hope that one may help. So it's a bit like saying, for every guy that does great, there's kind of 15 guys that you bust for that approach, but that's kind of not ethical. So which is Instagram, isn't it? They kind of advertise the guys that they help, but kind of keep quiet the 10 guys they've messed up, because that's just not good. That's kind of not good selling. So that's very much then which is true. They tell you about the guys that have got great in life, but not the 15 guys that are now in a complete mess, and which is the reality of what we have to pick through. So I think once you really understand the problem, both of those approaches are very, very helpful based on really how the player and what they respond to. Now, equally, so it's a bit like research in some ways, again, that understanding when something doesn't help is actually very powerful, because then you say, well, if you know it doesn't help, then why are you doing this? So when you actually locate that player A, so I kind of call it in some ways that, what's a disability for player A could actually be a great ability for player B. What doesn't help player A actually is very good for player B. So in some ways, it comes back to then the very advanced coaches, the very, I actually was, to digress, I was actually looking through your podcast. I was in the car driving somewhere last week, and only because one of my very dear friends, Kevin Kirk, I remember we had Kevin on a while ago, and Kevin and I are great mates, and I love Kevin to death.
The best.
Kev would be one of the most kind of balanced guys I know, certainly within golf coaching. So it really comes back to, again, the very established coaches like Kevin, for example, are the most adaptable coaches.
Right.
Because you remind yourself always whose session is it, mine or theirs. It's the player's session. So in essence, how can I help today? So really the approach you employ, some guys just need to have their handheld, don't do that, do this. Okay, got it. Which in some ways could kind of be the Ryder Cup from last weekend, that the players that I know on both sides, when you get to that Friday morning, they're in such a place in life, don't do that, just do this. Right, got it, okay, great, because they need that real, they don't need
confirmation.
To explore the affirmation in some ways, they don't need that exploration, and it needs to go in, the playful approach, because that's just not the right environment for that. And it even comes back to some ways that kind of how you use kind of motion capture or 3D data that, I get this a lot. I'm actually going to Glasgow tomorrow in Scotland before I come to the US on Monday. And you kind of look at it in some ways that you can be very divisive when you use 3D data, that to go and win the Open Championship today or your club championship today, just do this. But to really evolve through 2022, let's look at these areas over here. So you can actually use the same information in two very, very different ways. So on the Friday morning, at Western Straits last weekend, it doesn't matter who it is, do you know what, first tee, just do that. Okay, great, I've got it. But then you kind of say, now we're moving away from the Ryder Cup in, the FedEx is finished in the US, it's the race to Dubai is, I think it might be different what they've called it this year, but it's kind of happening in some format in Europe now. Okay, to win the Masters in April, we've now got 7 or 8 months, whatever it is. We can really look to explore then these areas. So even using 3D data can be used in kind of multiple different ways. So it's very much that for me. I kind of like to call it responders and non-responders, really understand what the player responds to and what they don't respond to. But understanding what they don't respond to can actually be more helpful than what they do, because then, just don't go near that stuff. So I think for me that the really established coaches like Kevin would be a good example, are just very, very good at adapting to, the player's demands, the player's needs. And certainly as I was actually talking to a group of guys on Monday, and I was kind of saying that, I've really, with introspection in some ways, one thing I really got badly wrong this year, and I really messed up badly. I've actually given the tournament players that I'm very privileged to be around actually too much autonomy. I've almost given those guys too much, if you can give too much autonomy, but a lot of those guys again have almost they've exhausted that movement approach. They've exhausted. We only know so much in life. They almost need to say, do you know what, Jason, just do that. Okay, just go and do this. So
I don't want to interrupt you there, but that was why I love this topic, because, as you said, I think the good coaches, the great coaches are doing both, right? They haven't, but they have it. In my opinion, the genius coaches have the ability to know when to pull that card. And like you said, I think it goes back to the interview process of knowing your player, asking the right questions, observations, like we talked about in the last podcast. Is, it's hard to teach that, right? I mean, I think it's just a lot of experience and a lot of, like you said, failing and seeing what doesn't work. Spent time, with your guy, Sean Foley. Mm-hmm. And I remember something that always stuck with me is he said, don't be afraid to be wrong. Right. So try a bunch of stuff and it's okay. Again, as long as you have that relationship with the player, then you can pivot and you can kind of find the solution together. Right.
I think that's right. I mean, just to expand on that's all very, very good unless 10 guys are messed up throughout that process. So I think that's absolutely right what Sean said there. As long as it doesn't come with any real kind of scar tissue that, we've taken this real, and let's just go and experiment and explore, but there's 10 guys.
You know what I'm saying though. It's like, I think it's more of a mindset. I'm not saying like try 100 things on a guy, but I think it's more about, maybe a better way to describe that would be trust your instincts as a coach, right?
Yeah. It's kind of knowledge and know-how. And I think I go back to, I think we may have even spoke about this a little bit last time, that the last thing golf needs is more information. We don't understand to big enough detail the information we currently have. So until we have almost the concept of mastery of being a master, until we can actually master mastery, then we don't need any more information until we really understand what we currently have. So for me, that's where know-how will always beat knowledge. I think you look at, say, coach education, over the last X amount of years now, it's been so knowledge-based. Can you quote complex physics? Can you quote, launch monitor? Can you quote 3D, for example? And that's in some ways, that's information processing. Mm-hmm. Knowing how to use that information is a very, very different discussion. So I think that's where I think the guys like Sean, I love Sean. Sean's the best. I mean, guys like Sean and Kevin are so very good. I mean, they kind of know how to use the information that they have. And that for me, in some ways, is the first step of the idea of kind of mastery of being a master.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of, you were mentioning some of the players, maybe it'd be great to have like a case study. Obviously you can't mention names of kind of how either side worked for you, and then some examples for the listeners.
Yeah, I mean, actually one of Sean's guys that I'm kind of very lucky to kind of spend time and work with, that we could do a 2-day session with him to compress into 3 words. And he actually did a very famous YouTube video, so I'll let the guys join the dots on this one. A very famous YouTube video, I think it might have been in February 2020 perhaps, when he won an event on the PGA Tour where it was, my reference was ear to ball. And I had a big smile that day because I thought, well, that was a 2-day discussion to get to 3 words. So we went through ear to ball. Literally was kind of ear to ball. So the essence was to get more rotation through his head and neck and advance of impact. But again, so it come back to what it meant in. But he had to go through kind of 2 days of discussion, almost kind of intellectual honesty in some ways, which I think don't start me on that stuff. I think we've had intellectual failure the last little bit, I think, within coaching. We certainly had intellectual dishonesty, I think, within coaching the last few years. So we had to go to that kind of intellectual honesty in some ways to really establish, okay, great. He's got that kind of, he's almost at peace in some ways, within accepted that all the other segments are moving well, that his observations are kind of where they need to be. He's kind of moving well, he's behaving well. It's all good. Right, okay, so to really go and perform and win, for example, in the event he played in that week, right, just do that, great. Now, if I said to him at the start of the session, let's just start to play with some task-based over here to ball, we go, why am I doing this?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Yeah, let me interrupt you there, because it's like, this is kind of the things that I think about when I'm coaching, especially just even average golfers, is they've even been trained so much that the expectation of the golf lesson is he's going to tell me what to do. Right. So when you're very quiet and you're observing and maybe even, like you said, throw a constraint up there and then say, all right, we'll just do this. They almost feel like they're not getting their money's worth when that's like the genius in the coaching. They don't even realize it. It's like being that salesman of how you deal with that. Like you said, you got to go through a lot of probably things that information based to get to something that could have been really, really simple.
Yeah. So it even goes back to where that expectation come from. Who created that expectation for that player to perceive that was a session? And you look at coaching, for example, and I live in a very romantic kind of world and in a very pragmatic world in some ways. That why do golf coaches charge for time, not solutions? I never understood that. Why do you spend an hour with somebody not to resolve the issue? But if you resolve it in 10 minutes, why do you stay at them for 50 more minutes?
That's me. Yeah, that's what happens when you're right all the time. It's like I'll change somebody, and you don't want to say change, but improve somebody. See, I'm working on the language.
Very good.
Yeah, I improve somebody in 10 or 15 minutes, and you got an hour, and then I'm going, what else are we going to do? We're going to sit here and be supervised practice, and then they get mad when you cut them 10 minutes short.
So I even define it that way. And for example, how do you want to use your time today? I don't like the word success. I think success is a very bad word in life. But you kind of say, how would you define a successful session there? Okay, so once we resolve that question, would you be happy? Yes. So I get that defined at the start of every session. So once they know they've answered that question, okay, then we're good. So in essence, like plumbers and electricians, you pay for them to resolve whatever issue you have, not to do an hour at your house. So why golf does that, I've got no idea. But just to go back, you reminded me, so apologies, around the idea of information processing, ecological systems. When you actually ask the player a question, the very first answer they provide actually reveals much about their kind of coaching and learning history. So examples, I've been around players in the past, I've kind of shared feedback, and they go, oh yeah, I've kind of done this in the past, I didn't particularly like it. So you know immediately, do you know what, just stay away from this stuff. Or I've been around players in the past, and I've kind of shared feedback, they go, oh, I've won a major championship doing this. To which my response is, why did he move away from doing that? So often the very first word that they use can really reveal much about both their movement history and also their coaching history. That players are very good at talking in code, that they kind of say that, but they mean this. So they're very good they're very good at coding a language that you actually look at then onto that stuff, that typically the words that we use reveal someone's belief systems in life. So just to kind of go back to that again, so those deep beliefs that we have, the words, the language that we use are the audible reference system of our belief system. So when you actually listen, it's a bit like in some ways, Jason, a lot of guys listen but they don't hear. A lot of guys look but they don't see. When you actually hear what someone is saying, they give you so many kind of come-ons in some ways, in a fun way, because of the words they use really reveals a lot about their beliefs. So if you really hear what the person's saying, you kind of go, you know what, if we go near that kind of the way the pelvis moves, how the spine rotates, what he does for that trail shoulder, he's not going to do that. It irritates them. They're actually called attractors in the brain. So attractors are the kind of those deep automated movements that we have. And it can often reinforce further when someone mentions my trail shoulder, do you know what, keep doing what I'm doing, because it evokes a very bad experience of, I went to see this guy, he mentioned my trail shoulder, it messed me up, so I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. So often you got to kind of work away from the problem to solve the problem. When they start to look at what the left hip does, and they might go, oh, when my kind of pelvis moves different around that left hip, it feels a bit different for that trail shoulder. So again, you've kind of guided them to find their answer just through kind of working away from the problem. So I think if you can get the audience, in particular the listeners that hopefully listen to this, that just really hear the words that people use when they answer that question, reveals so much about their beliefs in life, their concerns, their fears, what they do want to do, what they don't want to do. Very powerful stuff.
Yeah, I love that, and that's actually on my list is the language, and we're going to get into that. As far as the language we're using with our players as we're coaching. But I want to backtrack a little bit because you kind of got into a little bit about the sort of the order of human movement, right? And I've heard you talk about this a lot. And I think it was maybe where somebody asked a question about force, right? And force was on about number 6 or 7, right? So it starts with concept, doesn't it? Right? Or intent, right? So talk a little bit about what you would say the flow of what creates human movement. And then I want to we can kind of go into that language before we dive into some really cool biomechanics stuff.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Force absolutely precedes motion, but many things precede force. So, for example, my phone is kind of close to me at the moment. for sure, I need to apply a force to move the phone, but it's my intent to move the phone that happens before I kind of move my hand. So, I mean, intent controls most things in life. It's, in essence, what are you actually trying to achieve? Still one of my favorite questions. I get it a lot when guys come to see me. I might say, okay, if I came to you moving this way, how would you help me? And I've yet to meet one guy go, I don't know. They all give you their feedback. And so certainly one of my favorite kind of questions to ask that. So it goes back to intent. So intent's normally controlled by essentially memory and expectation. So most human suffering connects back to memory. So you look at people with dementia, they're some of the happiest people on the planet. They don't remember things. So you actually look at dementia, they're always smiling. We have a very famous phrase in called adventure before dementia for that reason. Enjoy yourself before, that stuff could happen, unfortunately. So yeah, I mean, dementia sufferers can be very happy in life because they don't remember much. So a lot of human suffering is actually connected to memory, how you choose to remember something. So how you remember, say, certain tee shots, certain outcomes, the 18th hole at Augusta, the first Open Championship, or whatever it might be, your club event, or everyone's got a club they don't like because there's a memory attached. I can't stand my 6-iron. I hate my 6-iron, for example. Why? You just got a bad memory attached. So you hit that shot that day, you went the thick rough, and you kind of lost your mates, that kind of stuff. So most things go back to kind of memory and expectation. If I move this way, what do I think might happen? And that really is reference against our historical memories of movement. So it's like saying to, I have a 3-year-old daughter, and if I said to my 3-year-old, don't touch that, it's hot, she's always going to touch it. Why? Because she's yet to experience it. When she actually picks up that hot plate, goes, oh, that's a little hot, Daddy, and she starts to develop a memory. So then I might say, if you pick up the plate, Scarlett, what do you think might happen? Then she won't do it. So just the words again, in how you kind of phrase that question. So really, almost every movement you make in life is kind of really reference against two things. Our expectations. If I kind of move the club that way, if I produce that type of kind of club delivery, if my feet move that way through impact, what do I think might happen based on my memory of the past? So all these things then influence things like, as you say, concept. So concept in itself is perhaps, so this is my error, so apologies to you for this, is perhaps the wrong word to use, is more the schema. So schema is in many ways the history behind the concept. What led you to believe that's true?
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense.
So this is where truths and beliefs are very different. Someone's belief versus someone's truth. So beliefs aren't always true in life. Some people think the world is flat despite there being mountains, but that's a different discussion. So what you believe and what's actually true are very, very different. So once you start to explore again the history behind why they believe that concept to be true, can really reveal so much about, again, their history of movement, history of learning. So once you kind of have that concept, we then start looking at things called affordances and constraints. So constraints are, like you said at the start of our kind of discussion today, for example, the club we use is a huge constraint. So I don't know nothing about baseball. So for my American friends, if I get this wrong, I sincerely apologize. You can hit from any part of the bat on a baseball bat. Fair? Pretty much, you can hit from any part of the bat. In essence,
to make it go forward, but maybe not to make it go as far as it could go.
Yeah, but in golf, you have to hit from a certain part of the club face. So you got to hit. You can hit from most parts of the bat to make a connection. So again, apologies for my American friends. I know nothing about baseball, which is evident by that comment. But certainly in golf, you have to hit from a certain part of the club. So still the biggest influence on why we move the way we do in golf is how we move to make the club work. Right. Which gets neglected by so much. So we get Instagrams into the real advanced stuff, and I smile when I do look at that stuff occasionally. But still, the biggest reason why we move the way we do in golf is the fact the ball was placed in position where it is, depending on what shot you're playing, tee shots, bunker shots, that kind of stuff. And the type of club, tool as it's called within dynamic systems, the type of tool that we're using to kind of make connection. So they're kind of called constraints. Affordances are then kind of, how many different ways can I do this? So again, I apologize to my American friends. And when I say cricket, they kind of fall asleep. So I apologize when I say cricket's one of my great loves in life. So cricket, the last 15 or so years, has evolved so much because of different types of cricket. They hit the most creative shots now have been discovered in recent years through the kind of playful approach. They just do all sorts of wonderful things. So they're called affordances in life. And then finally, you have something called conventions. Conventions are, okay, historically, how we've always done something. So when you get someone like Bryson, who I love, by the way, I think Bryson's great, comes out with, say, grips that are not tapered, clubs the similar lengths. He's really gone against convention, which is why, for me, he's evolved golf more than any player, certainly in recent years, because he's kind of moved away from conventional thinking. So all of those kind of influences, so memory, expectation, perception, schema, constraints, affordances, conventions, our reference system, all happen way in advance of the force. So the force, in some ways, through force plates and inverse dynamics, say through the kinematic data, you can kind of start to kind of plot and predict some of the forces being applied and produced. That is almost, again, the numerical reference of all those influences. So for me, force is the numerical values of intent, schema, memory, expectations. Then for me, the force itself is in some ways irrelevant. It's the story behind the force. What led the player that day to produce those force values is a much more advanced question than saying, well, X, Y, Z, that those are your forces around those planes of motion, if you believe there are such a things as planes of motion. And but for me, it's understanding why the player moved and produced those couples, those torques, those forces, is a much better question, rather than just saying, whether it be ground reaction force or club kinetics. For me, that's more about changing values, not really influencing how a player behaves and moves. And you find that a lot with players. You find that a lot with players. Jace actually had it with a young guy yesterday. Good player, European Tour player, great kid. And I kind of said to him, just be a little careful around this. That's just about all you've done there is really shift values on the screen. You haven't really improved how you move, which is very, very different. Is it sustainable? Is it meaningful? Can you move that way in your next event in a few weeks' time? Because not really. So all you've really done there is shift a value, which is typically what coaching can be online. You've changed values, but actually have you improved the player? So there's actually something very important within movement evolution called de-skilling. So de-skilling is very, very, almost goes back to what we said at the start around, the social media stuff, that they tell you about the guy they help, but the 15 guys that they mess up, they keep quiet. They've been de-skilled through coaching because often the values got better, but the player got worse because they were moved so far away from how they inherently see the planet. Mm-hmm. A bit like Bubba in some ways. So Bubba's caddy, Ted Scott, has become one of my dearest friends in the US. I love Ted. I mean, that guy I absolutely think is the best. I mean, just a wonderful human, Ted. And so if you kind of probably, Bubba's very good at being Bubba. So if you kind of took Bubba through most of these systematic programs that you might see through online social media, Bubba would conform to nothing. But good luck moving Bubba away from what Bubba does, because Bubba's the best at being him. So, Matt Wolf, I don't know Matt Wolf, but Matt Wolf would probably be another great example. He's very, very good at being him.
That's another topic there. It's like, how do you get changes? Like you said, a lot of times you can make people, you can improve the numbers or improve the pattern in a little short cycle in a lesson, but like, how do you think the best way to train somebody where it actually sticks? I mean, that's obviously the $1 million question from our side, coaching and for players. I mean, any thoughts on that? Like, I'm big on sort of deep practice, right? I'm big on doing stuff slowly. Again, all this research out there shows, learning to do it wrong, learning to do it differently to sort of find what works, or whatever, direction you're pushing that player. What are your thoughts on that?
I still have £1 million, $1 million, so in a good way. And £1 million would be nice, and $1 million as well. And I think it really goes back to, again, I've been around many players in the past where the expected normative values have all got worse, but the players got better, which is a really different discussion where you look at, say, the values we have on screen through the 3D system have all kind of moved away from the expected ranges that players often aspire to be in, but it's become more meaningful, it's become more playable, more sustainable. The players become exposed to less pain. They become more variable in their movement in a good way. For example, going back to like Bubba or Gus around the 11th, the playoff that time, they can hit kind of most shots. It's more reliable, but they move so far away from the historical values that golf likes to encourage. So I'm going to say to most guys, what's good for golf is irrelevant. It's kind of what's good for you. What golf wants is completely irrelevant. It's kind of what you need. So I think it really goes back again to kind of something you said there, which is it's such a devalued question by many. How can we help today? What questions would you like me to help you answer? You being the important bit there, not me. And so as long as we keep reminding ourselves, it's the player session. How can we help? We have this information. How would you like to use it? How would you, how would you define this to be a successful session? In many ways, kind of players guide us rather than vice versa. Mm-hmm. So it's almost that kind of perpetual guidance that we're guiding them and they're guiding us, rather than that very linear approach that, again, we tell the player what to do. Well, who are we to tell anybody what to do? Who am I to tell a 15-year-old what they should or shouldn't be doing? That's a very, very different discussion. The idea of the kind of the child voice is often kind of killed by the human or the adult. So who would it tell a 10-year-old young lady, for example, what to think when it comes to how they move? So it really comes back to me that, again, as long as you're very clear with the problem, for example, wrist pain or spine pain or distance or club delivery or movements which are problematic, depending on what the question might be, once you fully understand the problem, the solution in some ways just emerges. But unfortunately, certainly in my experience of being around, and I've been blessed in life and long may it continue. Now, I say to most guys, I think I'm the world's biggest overachiever for many, many reasons. And that's true, I can assure you of that. People just go straight to the solution. This is what you need to do. Well, need's a big word in life. You actually don't need many things in life. You'd think about it. You'd like to have them. You don't need them. So you actually look at the language of code. You need to do this, and this is what you have to do, and this is what players do. And just those words are, just wrong on every level. So really, I think it becomes that kind of perpetual guidance at both ends. The players are guiding us if we hear and see rather than look and listen. To then really establish that, okay, the players said this a few times, that when they move that way, they've had bad experiences. So just kind of ignore that, leave that. It doesn't matter what my values are. My values then become of no value. But if we can just start to kind of maybe shift the players' attention over here somewhere, intuitively and very organically in some ways, they may just start to adapt the segment that we'd like to improve, but in their own kind of playful way. So in some ways, you kind of get the answer without really ever asking that question.
No, that's good. I mean, it's interesting. Most of the people, I would say 98% of the people that come to us, maybe not to you because you get to work with, the highest level most of the time, but they're not so much in pain, but they're in pain because they're struggling. Yeah. Right. Like today I had a guy come to me and literally was hitting it off the shaft. I mean, he's hitting it, he's hitting it in the hosel, and because of a poor idea that maybe he was trying to do this, and this. So it was very clear that was not working. And so he was in a place where he's like, I need to know what to do. Right. So in that case, it's like, I could have done a lot of things, I guess, in the constraints led approach, but he would have gotten frustrated because he'd be like, well, are you going to tell me something? Because he was in that type of place. And I kind of realized that, and the way his trail arm was working and some things that we'll talk about going forward here that I'm interested in was basically causing a lot of the problem. So it's like those are the ones we get the most, even though, because I'm teaching mostly average golfers and some, high level tour players, but that's the stuff. It's like, again, it's like, you got to be able to shift and go, all right, this is definitely where we need to go. It's a moving target, as I always say, right?
Exactly. And I think you look at it that way as well, that you get a guy coming for a session of pain, you say, look, kind of press pause on that. I get that, appreciate that, but we've got to get you pain free, because pain and performance are inherently connected. You can't perform if you're in pain, and if you're in pain, you can't perform if you're in pain, and the performance is then obviously influenced because of pain. So if someone comes in for a session with me and they've got whatever, just say wrist pain again, you say, look, I get this. We'll come to that. I appreciate that, but we've got to get you pain-free first. And this is the dark side in some ways of ecological dynamics, that what they don't consider to acknowledge is how the player moves to produce the outcome. So you could say, look, let's use just say a launch monitor as a way of, through, again, it can be done wonderfully intuitively, wonderfully externally, wonderfully playfully in many ways, just to kind of improve club delivery. But what it doesn't tell you, launch monitor, is actually how someone moved to produce those values. It just gives you the prediction of what the club was doing.
Right.
That's the real dark side of, say, the ecological approach is, as long as they complete the task, the perception is they must have moved well, when that's simply not true. So that's where I'm always, I live in conflict every day. So that's one of my big conflicts, that, they're producing, they're completing the task, they're doing what the task demanded, but actually how they're kind of completing that task, we know through history now. So history is very good at leaving clues in life. That when players move that way, that could become problematic. So if we know that stuff, it's like saying we know smoking. My dad currently has bladder cancer through smoking. He's on his 11th bladder cancer treatment. We know that smoking is not good for you. So if you know that, why do you smoke? And so we kind of know things through life that we just aren't good for us. So if you kind of know moving, for example, like increasing radial deviation and extension, that trail risk and transition, we know is most likely the single biggest reason why people get trail wrist pain, then why would you encourage that? So that's kind of one of my, and I'm very into this with players, that you're friendly without being their friend. Very important when you work with players, you're friendly with them, but you're not their friend. And you say, look, if you move that way in life and it goes wrong, then, remind me, how can I help you? That we know that moving that way is not advantageous. You've chosen to kind of ignore the feedback I've provided and continue moving that way. So if it breaks, what I say to you today, I didn't say to you 6 months ago. I actually had that with a young player in England, 3 or 4 years ago, a very good player, Curtis Cup player, so a good player at the time. And I kind of suggested in the most, because I hope it was kind of polite, very kind of respectful, kind of very humble way, that perhaps that the way she's moving may not be kind of helpful over life because of the demands in the ranges that risk is being taken through in transition. We know historically, it could become kind of problematic. And her dad almost wanted to hit me. He wanted to fight pretty much in the session. I was like, when you go, hold on a second, what have I just said? And no, I didn't know. I was kind of really polite and very kind of unassuming and very quiet about stuff. That I said it. I'm thinking, if I said something wrong or something happened, that the guy literally wanted to have a fight with me. How dare you say that about my daughter? Do you know who she is? Well, am I meant to know who she is? And how dare you suggest she's going to get sore? Look, do you know what? You come to see me for a session. I kind of shared my feedback, and I apologize. You've kind of received it that way, but I have a duty of care, an ethical duty of care, that if I don't kind of provide honest feedback, then if something does go wrong, then you'd rightly have the right to kind of complain. Anyway, so 6 months on, I get a phone call. She just had surgery on her wrist.
Oh my!
And the dad was like, we need to have a meeting. I was like, why? What? I said, you chose to ignore me 6 months ago. So what do I say to you today? I didn't say to you 6 months back. And I was really firm with this guy. I said, there's no kind of yeah buts. I said, you chose to ignore this. This is on you, pal, in a nice way. Your daughter's now just had surgery and she's in a cast because of your ego and your interference. That this could have been resolved 6 months ago. So I'm very big on this with the younger coaches, that have that slightly annoying discussion today or very, very bad one in 6 months' time.
Yeah,
and I actually refused to see the girl for a session because the dad had to learn. It's a great shame. She's a wonderful young lady and absolutely delight to spend time with, but he had to learn. It's on him. The reason why she had surgery and missed then another 6 months of the year, and still hasn't fully recovered because of him. So unfortunately, sometimes you got to just be, again, do you know what? You need to go, take ownership of your actions there. That because your ego and your interference, it kind of affected your daughter. So I refuse to see her. Well, where does it say in life we have to see players?
You don't. You can,
not with dads like I didn't. Not with dads like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's a nice thing you can do if you.
Yeah.
If you don't have members that are, members of your club that want to see you, you can't pick and choose. But
it might cost me a few quid. It might cost me a few quid, that approach, but it kind of makes you sleep better at night. And I'd sooner sleep well at night and have an extra few quid in the bank. So
there you go. You're doing okay. So let's expand on wrist movements and sort of trail arm mechanics. Let's kind of dig into some of the things that you're finding, because this is always very interesting to me. I'm love to hear your take, and I've watched some of your videos, and there's some great information that you've shared, in the 3D world, sort of what you're finding the better players are doing with the wrist angles, and then you can kind of go into trail arm mechanics as well. And then I've got some follow-up on that, if you don't mind, kind of going into that information. I think it's something that we've really been talking a lot about in the teaching world, because I think it's super important, right? I mean, the hands do so much in the golf swing, control the face, and I think if you don't understand what the wrists are doing, then you're going to have a tough time improving somebody's club face awareness.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of say that you're absolutely right. I mean, that really is such an expansive question, which I'm sure I miss out bits. So I apologise to the listeners if I miss bits out, just because it's such a big question, this. So I kind of say to most guys that if you ever get in a situation where, and I do it every day, I mean, I mess up most days, and I'm very aware of that. You get a guy coming for a session, you go, despite the questions being asked and, all the discussion, and you just go, do you know what? I really have no idea what to do with this player, because I get that most days. My kind of little kind of default is, if you get the trail arm moving well, they normally kind of move well and improve. For me, it's still the most influential segment on why we move the way we do. So how that kind of, the hand, the wrist, the trail arm into the shoulder and the scapula, how that kind of trail arm moves, pretty much controls even things like ground reaction force. So to kind of walk this out as an example, that the hands are pretty much the first segment to really show a positional change in golf. There's rotational changes happens with the neck, the feet, for example, but certainly as far as positional changes or translational changes, the hands are the segment that really kind of changes kind of position first. The trail wrist goes through much bigger ranges than the lead wrist. So that you look at how the trail arm moves, it goes through much bigger ranges, both for the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, and that lead arm. So when we then start looking at just say bone configuration or in kind of joint configuration, that how the wrist moves anatomically, or certainly intrinsic biomechanics now, so the biomechanics inside the human, how the wrist moves controls what the elbow does. So these are called kind of degrees of freedom, how those degrees of freedom interact. How the elbow moves to a level controls what the shoulder does. How the shoulder and the scapula move controls what the thorax does. How the thorax moves then controls pelvis. You probably know where I'm going with this now. How the pelvis moves starts to connect into lower limb. So still one of the biggest reasons why you get ground reaction force data, certainly through backs, and it's how you move through hand and wrist. So certainly when we look at ground reaction force, there's a key word in that phrase, reaction. What's it responding to? Well, how the feet leverage against the ground, great, yes. But why are the feet leveraging that way? Because of what's happening in advance, for example, that how we move, again, intent, concept, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But more kind of look at the tangible side of the movement, so how that kind of trail wrist moves. Then very much so, I kind of get guys that I know the audience can't see this, but for the audience at home now, just kind of put your hands in like a kind of handshake position and point the little finger downwards. You can kind of go finger down, finger up, so kind of radar on a deviation. Now, in that kind of handshake position, put the wrist in flexion. Now try and do on a radial deviation. You supinate and pronate. So the position of the wrist will control how the forearm, the elbow, the humerus, into the glenoid, the shoulder joint, the scapula, how those bones interact and move are very much controlled by how and in what direction and what ranges and what order the wrist moves through. So a lot of what we see through the trail shoulder just connects back to how we move through the trail wrist, and that's a very kind of circular, kind of binary discussion. How the trail shoulder sits anatomically. So one of the biggest adaptations you see within say human frame is kind of the humeral head, the long bone in the upper arm. Certainly in most kind of, for left-handed players, Jason, just get the guys to invert this, but for most right-handed players, certainly the established guys, that humeral head can sit forward in the glenoid, so the humeral head is forwards. So that will really challenge then the ranges, again, the affordances that you have around that shoulder joint. So it becomes that very binary discussion. How the wrist moves controls what the shoulder does, but the position or the orientation of that shoulder address will control how the wrist moves. So there's that lovely interaction. Then you've got the scapula and connection to the neck, the cervical spine, that kind of stuff, and the thorax. So as far as how, of all the segments we have, invariably, when the right arm moves well, the trail arm moves well, most other segments invariably improve to a level. However, when the trail arm starts to misbehave, almost all other segments adapt in response. So if you get that trail arm moving well, for example, how the wrist moves, going back to we know in transition. This is accepted and established. Look at orthopedics, orthopedic feedback, intrinsic biomechanics, wrist pain, how the hands interact with the club. We know that, say, for example, if someone's maxed out at top of backswing, so most people have typically, again, within the population, 25 degrees-ish of radial deviation in the wrist, and depends on kind of joint elasticity and range. For example, you've probably got about 50 to 60 degrees of extension in that wrist. If you max out those ranges at top of backswing, we know that forcing that wrist through ranges it simply doesn't have. So you increase radial deviation, you increase extension in that trail wrist, and you take that wrist through ranges that anatomically we don't have. We know through design and through history that's an issue. And if you know that, why would you encourage that? So why would you actively? And this is where I think 3D data has been really poorly. It's not the data, it's just how it's being used. I kind of say to most guys that when people say, for example, TrackMan, I love TrackMan. So TrackMan said, well, I wasn't aware TrackMan spoke. You just chose to see it that way.
Exactly.
Didn't know
TrackMan doesn't have a philosophy.
Don't know TrackMan goes speak, but okay, that's a different discussion. You just chose the route. So it's not TrackMan's fault. You read it that way. So when you get guys that look at 3D data and they see that the lead wrist moves more towards flexion in transition, that's a very intuitive response to multiple influences that happen when a variance of the wrist moves. So that's a response, not an active thought to move that way. So again, I can only share my experiences. Now, this is where it becomes a really wonderful discussion. I'm sure there's many guys listening to this in a good way going, well, I know players that try and move that. Well, that's different. I can't answer that because I can only really give my experiences. I've yet to meet one, and I've been very blessed, and I might continue to work with some very good players, ever actively trying to increase lead wrist flexion in transition. Because when the lead wrist goes into flexion, the trail wrist does what? It gets taken through ranges it doesn't have, which is why you get so many trail wrist issues for whatever reason. So it often comes back to the lead wrist will move more towards flexion because of really what happens through lower limb, through pelvis. It's actually called wave propagation. To go into more detailed and more complex movement anatomy, it's called wave propagation, how we move water through our system and how water propagates that vortex, the wave moves through our body, the most distal segment being the hand. So the reason why the wrist will get taken more towards flexion is because that's the end of the wave in some ways. So that as that kind of wave, that energy, that water system. So you think about, humans are 90% plus water. Water is a non-compressible substance. You can't compress water. All you do is push it somewhere else. So how you move through lower limb, how you move through pelvis, how the spine moves, how the diaphragm moves, how the diaphragm connects into the pelvic floor, how the thorax moves, the scapula moves. That wave migrates along that trail arm, or both arms, in fact. So then the end of the wave is the wrist then start to move that way because of that internal vortex that we produce.
Is that fair to say that's sort of a reasonable sequence? I mean, I know the kinematic sequence is not absolute, but I mean, is that what that lead wrist is responding to? Yeah. Is that what you're saying, basically?
Yeah.
Is good movements from the chain up?
Massively. Well, actually, it'd be from the chain down because intent comes before force, so intent's in the brain. So it should be should be from the top down, not the bottom up. And even more precise, perception. In our perception, still many comes from visual-based feedback, how you perceive the environment around us. Mm-hmm. So you're absolutely right there. So when you look at, say, wrist movement, I can only give. It's only me, Jason. So again, I'm a sample of one. I can't recall the last time I actively encouraged someone to move their wrist different in transition, but almost always, when we've improved, say, how other segments move, the trail arm, the scapula, the neck, how they move through the rib cage, the thorax, how they move through pelvis, lower limb, almost always the wrist adapts and responds in a very, very healthy, advantageous way. Because often what you find by shifting the wrist is, yes, you change values, doesn't mean it improves the player. Yes, you might get an initial response where they get better club delivery and they resolve that question. But let's see what that guy's out in 6 months' time when they come back with, my wrist has now got multicolored kinesio tape all over it because it looks cool to have camouflage tape and that kind of stuff. Well, no, it's actually not cool anyway. And they've now they've moved past that thought because they're now that didn't sustain because it didn't work. So that's more noise, that's more scar tissue around them because they haven't really understood why the values displayed that way in transition. So that's very much around just shifting values, changing the aesthetics of movement. So it might look. So I kind of gave. I remember speaking at a conference in the US a couple of years ago. A great audience. I kind of showed two players on his examples. One guy was a recent major champion who's kind of accepted amongst his peers to probably have one of the better movements in golf. Multiple surgeries, missed 6 months of the season in such a mess, but had great wrist data and transition, and actually had wrist pain. Another guy, it was very good European Tour player. You looked at him and go, mate, how on earth do you play on the European Tour? Awful wrist data, never had pain in his life. And the audience just sat there silent. So when you look at pain, for example, pain's really controlled by kind of three things: how resilient the joint is, how sensitive the nervous system is, and how tolerant the tissues are. So some guys are just more resilient, less sensitive, and more tolerant to certain movements. So when you just start looking at these wrist data, wrist values in transition, I mean, for me, I could simply never, ever make a call on how someone moves in the golf swing by wrist data alone. For me, that really, and I say this with great kindness, absolute intellectual failure, trying to establish how someone moves when you look at wrist data only. It's understanding why the values are being produced that way. It's very, very, for me, a much more explore. And I really do mean that in kindness. That's not meant in an abrasive way. If someone said to me, Mark, here's whoever, it doesn't matter who they are, recreational player or Ryder Cup player, there's a wrist data, I'd be like, and? Yeah, I'm not that good, unfortunately. I couldn't help them. I wouldn't know where to start. I need to know how the wrist is interacting and relating to all other segments to really then establish why it's behaving the way it does.
Well, when you have that, getting back into trail arm mechanics, and I know I've seen a few videos that you've put out with sort of the difference between, good movement with the trail arm and poor movement with the trail arm. I mean, I go back to like super old school of like, all right, how do you make a sidearm throw, right? Yep. So where the trail elbow kind of leads the wrist or stays in front of the trail shoulder. I mean, I train people like that all the time, and you find out just by having them make a sidearm throw how athletic or not athletic they are, and what you see, and you tend to see that show up in their golf swing as well. I mean, you talked about P5, how that right elbow kicks out, and really affects obviously club delivery
massively.
So expand on that a little bit, better than I did probably from a 3D standpoint. And then I just want to know how do you improve somebody's trail arm mechanics? Any drills? I mean, we can go deep.
I like
training.
references. I think you look at, say, how dancers. I mean, dances. You look at really contemporary dancers. Some of the best movers we have in life are these contemporary dancers. I mean, just spectacular movers. These people. And so, despite all the kind of the wonderful autonomy and the wonderful kind of flow of dance, which I love. Not that I can dance in any way. Dance is actually taught through position. Get here to there, get here to there. Now, how the player goes from there to there is very much then that creative side of dance. But dance is very positional based. A to B, here to there. And again, I can only share my experience. I like using references. So when you kind of give someone very defined references through, again, refinement, becoming more precise as they kind of move and evolve through that kind of session, they invariably start to kind of move the arm better. So I think I like reference systems. Might be kind of how the wrist moves relative to the elbow, how the elbow moves relative to the shoulder. So I use a lot of references of players around. So again, you kind of give them, you want to get there, show me how you fill the gaps in. they almost always intuitively start to move a little differently. Then obviously I'll refine it by going back to the start of our discussion today around more the ecological systems. Okay, based on what you see, based on what you know, make the adjustment. You're not given explicit feedback. You're kind of using things like mirrors or whatever it might be. And
is that fair? Sorry to interrupt you there.
No.
Is that, and this goes back to something that I've seen you talk about, and I do the same thing, is I know impact, obviously everything's going very fast, but I find it very important or advantageous to show somebody what they're supposed to look like at impact and how that can affect them sort of connecting the dots to getting there or change their movement patterns. Is that sort of what you're talking about as far as, you know, giving them something different to see how they adapt?
Yeah, I kind of, you know, crudely speaking, now this is not the bus in any way. It's a kind of, again, you got to start, like most things in life, you got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
So it's a crude kind of reference. I kind of give people kind of a roundabout, call it shaft parallel and backswing. So I'm not super familiar with the P system as I should be, so I apologize for that.
Yeah, me too.
I kind of say, you know, elbow beneath shoulder joint. So the humerus is hanging down vertically. Why? Because that's an
you're talking about down. Are we talking about downswing?
Backswing. So kind of
backswing. Okay, yes, it'd be too.
So the elbow beneath shoulder joint. Why? Because that allows the shoulder blade, the scapula, to sit nicely connected to that rib cage. And then roughly about the kind of same reference halfway down, elbow beneath shoulder, an impact, elbow beneath shoulder, halfway into through swing, elbow inside of shoulder. Yeah. And almost always, people just go, okay, that's a little different. Then they actually start to adapt then, foot and ankle movement, pelvis movement, which is the idea of dance. You give a position, but they then adapt all of the segments to produce and allow that position to happen. So references of positions sometimes have been a bit kind of, you know, how dare you give someone a position?
This is awesome because sometimes people say, well, you're a position teacher. Well, how else are you going to get somebody to change or not change, improve? Yeah. How are you going to get somebody to improve if they don't know like where the club's supposed to be or where a body part's supposed to be, right? Like good example of that, you know, the guy that I taught today that was hitting it off the hosel, he was demonstrating that sort of trail arm movement where he thought that the right arm should straighten before impact. Yeah. Right. Which was throwing the sweet spot out and his elbow was kicking out like we discussed. And obviously that's not what so as soon as I showed him like this is where the right arm should be or the right wrist should be in this space, then his whole concept of something different changed, and we got the thing in the middle of the club face, and you know, it's definitely going to improve this guy.
Yeah, it's just called, it's kind of body postures, it's called. So it's kind of using static postures is what it's called in dance. Your defense, all I've given someone is a static posture reference, which is a much more precise and accurate definition than the position. So you look at, dance is taught through static postural positions. Even the most wonderful Latin dances, I mean, those guys are just remarkable. They're actually taught through static postural positions. So that's really what you're given that player. So really what you then allow them to is, okay, show me how you could move to produce that reference. So you've got that kind of trade between, you're giving someone a very kind of refined and very precise kind of movement, but done in a very autonomous way. Okay, based on what you now know, Jason, in this case, show me kind of how you can move in transition to produce that kind of elbow impact movement. So to really expand on that then, is certainly the more established players, it's kind of less successful, say more recreational, occasional players, that's still the most realistic way of, say, improving a very established player's backswing, give them a very, very different concept of impact. They almost always adapt backswing when their concept of impact is shifted. Okay, so you kind of say to someone, okay, based on what you now know or based on what you'd like to do with a club through impact, they show me how you can best stand at address and how you can best move through backswing to allow that kind of club delivery to happen. And you meet very few players that stand and hold the same and move back the same when they know how the club now would like to move. It's called forward planning. So forward planning within movement is huge within the neurological side of movement. The brain in many ways is doing way before it does. So the brain is doing things before it does something. So it's called forward planning. So The brain knows in advance where joints are, the range is available, it knows in space where all those segments are positioned. So it knows, okay, if I got to get here from there, but I'm over there, how do I need to move in advance to kind of make that movement happen? So it plans and plots movement way before you and I would experience it or observe it. So, the player would be the one that experiences the movement. You and I are the one that observes the movement, but the brain plotted that multiple frames in advance. So, you kind of allow forward planning to happen through. Here's a static body posture, which for some can be kind of seen as the absolute dark side of coaching. But it's how the most intuitive, most of the most intuitive sports are taught through static body postures.
Interesting.
But
yeah,
what you
I love that because I do that a lot. It's happy to think that it's actually valid, right?
Yeah. But again, then you go, well, who says it's wrong? You or the player? Who's right or wrong now? The coach, if the player goes, what, that won me £1 million and maybe win the Open Championship. Good luck saying that's wrong.
I've had success doing it. It's sort of, like you said, success leaves clues, and I just kind of keep doing things that work and then move away from things that don't seem to work. Right?
Absolutely right. It goes back to the player that you and I spoke about earlier. That we went through multiple static postures to compress it into 3 words in the most external feedback system possible. Ear at the ball. But we had to go through multiple static postures to establish that, which is what that kind of procedure was that day. That process that day was going to all these references in P systems, in mirrors, in discussion to get to the most intuitive way of, okay, I'll put the big toe over there. Well, go and do that then. But we had to go through that. Like I said, we had to go through that 2-day procedure to get to those 3 words. It's one of my favorite stories in recent times.
That's awesome. So you made an Instagram post the other day, and something that we spoke a little bit about on the last podcast was feet and ankles, right? How you establish foot flare, which I think would be really a good one to review, and also how the feet and ankles basically can change the way the pelvis moves or affects the way the pelvis moves. Give us a little bit of that.
I mean, massive.
Detail.
You look at anatomy. I mean, again, these are established kind of accepted approaches. Everything affects everything because everything's connected to everything. That's a pretty established approach within. But looking more locally, you can, the neck and the feet interact hugely. So how the cervical spine moves, how the jaw moves. So just to expand on that, because it needs expansion, is that humans are the only mammals not to walk at birth because we're not born with teeth. Every mammal which has teeth walks at birth. So the human gait cycle starts when the molars first start to initially form within the gums. So babies initially start the kind of process of crawling, standing, walking when those molars are just starting to develop deep inside the gums. So when you actually go back to gait cycles in how we walk, it actually connects back to when the teeth and how the teeth grow, which is why human babies don't walk when they're born, because they're not born with teeth. So you actually look at the whole system. I mean, everything affects what the feet do. But when you look at it locally, foot and ankle and hip and pelvis are inherently connected. So again, it becomes that kind of very binary approach that how the lumbar spine, the pelvis and the hip move controls what the ankle and the foot does, and then vice versa. A bit like the wrist and shoulder in some ways. If you do a handstand and invert the body, the hands become the feet, the wrist becomes the ankle, the elbow becomes the knee, the shoulder becomes the hip. To a very small level, arms and feet are the same if you just do a handstand. Similar kind of thing. So the wrist controls the shoulder controls the wrist, the foot and ankle control the hip controls the foot and ankle. So the way they really establish this within golf is to the idea of kind of what's affecting what, which is one of my kind of favorite approaches, really what's influencing what. If we improve what the foot and ankle does, again, the idea of responders and non-responders again, what response does one observe through the pelvis? Do you know what? They actually get a little worse, and it irritates how they move, and they get really slow, and it disrupts the movement, and they kind of get referred kind of irritation, pain into the neck. Well, that doesn't work for them. Or if we improve the hip and pelvis, what does the foot and ankle do? Well, the foot and ankle now really starts to, for example, you might get really different ground-based ground action force data by adjusting how the hip and pelvis interact. So you've always got to look at it in that very circular binary way. If I improve the foot and ankle, how does the hip respond? If I improve the hip, what does the foot and ankle do? And it's normally very palpable when you improve one or the other, which one gives you the best response. And equally so, this is where, again, it kind of goes back to the start of our call today. Often the players removed from the learning process. It becomes more about the coach saying, look, I'm right. I told you what, validation, ego. I told you I was right. I got it right again. That's just coaching, validation, ego. Because the player's removed from that process. The player will decide which one they best connect with. So often you might go, let's just improve how the pelvis moves. They go, oh, I really feel different through my neck when I do that. Great, because that's allowed the neck to now move well. So it's very much that, yeah, I mean, locally, through lower limb biomechanics in particular, how the foot and ankle moves hugely controls what the hip does. Hugely. Going back to, again, how the foot interacts with the floor, ground reaction force, waves, the propagation that waves up through, through the femur into the hip joint. But going back to, say, anatomical constraints, one of the more common ones you see in a lot of players, again, is the femoral head actually sits forward of the acetabulum. So the acetabulum, the hip joint, the socket within the pelvis. The actual femoral head can sit forwards in many players. So it really then changes how the foot and ankle move because they've had to adapt foot and ankle, again, forward planning. This is where we look at, hopefully, what we've discussed today, which has been great, by the way. There's so many threads that thread all the discussion together. And you can look at it somewhere, you go, well, ecological dynamics. Now we're talking about intrinsic biomechanics. We're talking about foot and ankle. We're talking about the neck. It's this wonderful thread that connects all. Because you might then say they've adapted the foot and ankle. So you're now seeing some. I actually really enjoyed your podcast with Scott Lynn. Scott and I have actually become kind of fairly close over the last few months, which has been great. And I actually enjoyed your podcast with Scott. So Scott might then really start to see some really interesting ground data again. But to again, why is the player move? Why are those values being produced? Is a much bigger question than saying. And I love Scott, so this is the name of Scott. Anyway, Scott's brilliant. I just kind of use Scott as an example. Rather than saying you've got to get more horizontal force in transition, well, good luck doing that when that femoral head sits forwards.
Yeah, and you're talking about, we're go deeper onto that. Like maybe to, obviously it'd be easy if you could stand there, obviously, and it's not, this is a podcast of, you're talking about a postural position, right?
Yeah, an adaptation.
The pelvis.
An adaptation.
Go into a little more detail so that listeners can kind of understand what you're saying there.
So 3 of the more common adaptations you see happen at the satator joint and the foot. So that can sit forward. So again, it really influences how the foot and ankle kind of pronate, supinate, invert, dorsiflex, plantar flex, for example. It really affects us how the foot moves. So we often really start to force the foot through movements or certain ranges, or even up in the tib and the fib, up into the knee, up in the femur, because of that real constrained ankle position. So you might see someone kind of lose that medial border as they kind of, through that trail foot, as they move into backswing. So they move on to that lateral border of the foot. So saying keep connection through the medial part of the foot is simply not helpful if they've had to use the foot as a way of moving around the ankle joint. It'd be like saying, if you've got someone with that the femoral head on the right side really forward in the joint, so essentially the long bone is kind of sat forward and it's really sat at the front of the joint. So you've lost that wonderful kind of glide of that femur inside the hip joint, so it kind of sits a little forward and it doesn't really move that well. So what you might see as an example could be through backswing, the player's pelvis moves a long way toward the target, left around the player, or that lead hip really kind of thrusts forwards. So someone might say, well, let's avoid that pelvis moving that way, let's avoid that hip moving that way. But they've simply moved the pelvis that way as a way of moving around that constrained trail hip. So often, I mean, a lot of what you see with the movement is just how players move around the constraints placed upon them. Things like neck issues, or through the humeral head can be forward. So you might get someone who, that first move is the wrist goes into huge amounts of extension. The elbow gets pushed behind them. That trail scapula starts to kind of elevate and kind of disconnect off the rib cage. Why? Because of the position of that shoulder joint. That even then goes into, say, some testing protocols that can be used, that someone might look like they have reduced external or lateral rotation of the shoulder joint, which may be true. The reality is it's more the position is being tested from. So if you've got someone might lack hip range, no, they've got plenty of range. It's just the way the femur goes into the joint isn't allowing the pelvis to move well. Someone might display as lacking lots of pronation and supination of the foot. No, just because of the way the ankle sits doesn't let the foot pronate and supinate. Someone might display as having less than whatever external range in that shoulder joint. No, just because the humeral head's so far forward, it doesn't glide and rotate in that glean or the shoulder joint very well. So I think before you can actually establish the ranges players produce, you've got to look at what position are they actually being asked to move from.
Yeah, I think that you talked about this. I think one of your segments was how you teach posture, right? Too much anterior tilt. I guess what PPI would kind of call S curve, right, where people are trying to get their backs really straight, upper lumbar. Is that sort of what you're talking about? Is like getting somebody in a more forward bend from the mid thoracic rather than trying to get them to like stick their tail out?
Yeah, I think one of the common ones that I guess people will see is, people bend more to the lumbar spine, not to the hip joint. So they kind of bend to the lumbar spine and elevate up to the rib cage. So you get a lot of kind of extension through things like thoracolumbar junction, where the lumbar spine and thoracic spine kind of join. So people can visibly, again, this is the aesthetics again. They're very, very good at making things kind of look like where they need to be. But again, it's actually how has that player moved to establish that start position, rather than saying, it's a bit like saying even this is where 3D values can become so unhelpful. So people like me have a lot to answer for in life. In some ways, the kind of cure became the disease in many ways. So people like me have really created a lot of problems, because if it says the values are great, therefore they must be good. Well, why? How? Says who? How do we actually know segmentally and intrinsically that person has actually, established that start position in such a way that best allows them to move well, rotate and produce force well. So again, you might get someone who's got great setup values, but how they stood to produce those values is dreadful, which is most people, unfortunately. So the very common ones you'll see, Jason, a lot of guys bend to their lumbar spine, then they elevate and extend through their rib cage. So that puts a lot of compression through the thoracolumbar junction, the lumbar spine, really expands the rib cage. It kind of disconnects the diaphragm off the pelvic floor. So things like breathing changes, we get active through things like paraspinal, the muscles at the back. When paraspinals get overactive, one of the main roles is to prevent rotation. So good luck getting rotation when you stand that way, but that person can kind of stand in such a way that actually produces good 3D values. So the assumption is, you look at, say, my software, whatever it might be, so hence I'm the problem, their values are great, or they're standing great. It's terrible.
Can't hit the ball.
They can't move. They can't move.
It's tough to measure. It's tough to measure hand-eye coordination a lot of times, right? Like you said, the European player that kind of looks different, that can stripe it. And it's like great, fine motor skills to put the club on the ball is sometimes misunderstood.
He's just very, very good at golf, that guy. And Lomek said,
right.
He's kind of good despite the information. He's kind of good despite the coaching, where I think a lot of very established players are actually very, very good despite the information they often get. And I mean that again in a very kind, that's meant with love, and I really do mean that. They're kind of good despite what they're trying to do, because they're just good at golf. They chose their parents well. You and you, please. And they just chose their parents great way back when. I
love it. So what are some of the things that you've found? I know, again, we're not talking about tour averages here. That's a bad thing, as we know. Is what are the best players doing? How are the best players moving, and why? Or some of the things that you've noticed just with all the 3D data that you've been able to get from great players.
They're very good at establishing what's best for them. That's priority number one. They're very good at, again, with the anatomy, the physiology, the intrinsic biomechanics that they have. They're very, very good at using what they have. So again, they're very good at being samples of one, these guys. But there are threads that run through most players. So if you say Augusta, because it's the next major championship, or even said the US Open, sorry, USPGA, because it's the next kind of full field major championship. If we went to the PGA Championship next year, there'd be threads that run through many of the players. So they might look different visibly, they might look different aesthetically, they might all have different conceptual perceptions. They might, they might write down different kind of philosophies. When you look at it, what it really is, that they produce very similar threads between how they move. Some examples might be how they produce rotation is vital. So you look at rotation as an example. Really, how much you rotate in golf really isn't that important, but how well you produce rotation is vital. And to really expand on that, rotation is only a value in golf until someone first adapts. So you look at, so I could force myself through some pretty unpleasant movements to produce whatever 100 degrees of rotation through the thorax, and we can look at how they define and how they measure 100 degrees a different day. On it's very hard to get thorax or spine rotation with one sensor on the spine, so that's a whole different discussion. But looking at it very crudely and very playfully, I can really force those joints with some pretty unpleasant ranges to produce 100 degrees. So rotation is only a value until the spine starts to adapt in a very kind of problematic, unhelpful way. For example, they start to move into excessive lateral flexion. They start to move towards dominance in, say, extension, or they're producing a lot of rotations in, different parts of the spine in particular. So what you find with very, very, very advanced, very accomplished movers is most of the guys produce rotation in a wonderful way. They're good rotators, these guys. Other examples might be there's certain pelvis movements that we know in transition. It's unusual to see a very accomplished person they all have different scales or different timings, but there's a thread that the pelvis would typically kind of glide laterally as it rotates in transition. You go back to things like the lead arm rib cage interaction. Adduction is actually horizontal adduction, to be precise. You look at the less established players in transition, they actually compress the lead arm onto that rib cage to try and produce adduction, which is not adduction. The very established movers rotate the rib cage into that lead arm in transition to create more realistic horizontal adduction in that lead arm. So there's lots of threads that you see, how rotations produce, how the pelvis will glide in transition, how that lead arm, shoulder, scapula, thorax moves. Another big one you see in a lot of the very, very good movers in particular, Jason, is kind of how they move kind of through that, along that big toe of that right foot or trail foot in transition. So the first metatarsal of the foot is the line of force of the foot. So first, I call it the elastic point of rotation. For us to kind of rotate and move, we have to move force. This is just anatomy. Forget golf. Golf is the problem in sometimes, because then you look at it, what golf is trying to encourage is such a conflict to anatomy. So you've got this great conflict that the concept of that particular movement in golf is so conflicting to how mum and dad kind of designed us to move well. But that's golf in a fun way. So when you look at how the foot moves, the line of force goes along the first metatarsal of the foot. So you look at the really good guys, they really move. The
big toe?
Yeah, so you lift up your big toe, it's a long bone that kind of suddenly is evident for many people in the foot. That's the line of force of the foot. So the very good players are very good at moving force along that part of the foot. Kind of very efficient movers in some ways. So there's all these threads that you see, so they can look different because of things like frame shapes, frames, frame configurations, even types of footwear that players use, that kind of stuff. So that will obviously really change the visual aesthetics. When you actually look at how these guys move, there's a lot of threads that run through many of them.
So what about what have you noticed about the hand path? That was one of the ones I heard you talk about, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah. So again, you always have to say, allowing for someone doing something different in backswing. So that's what makes golf such fun. There's always someone somewhere, which is great. Right. It's always
the exception.
There's always some, and they're normally the exceptions are normally exceptional, which is what makes them exceptions.
That.
They're exceptions for a reason, because they're exceptional at what they do, which is why they became an exception. And you look at again, most of the very established guys on both the PGA and European Tour, the hand path and downswing would sit slightly, let's call it on top of or outside on front of the hand path it goes back on. That's not the club head path. That's very different. So we look at say just tracing the hand path in transition, allowing for the hand path being somewhat near where many guys would encourage in backswing, allowing for obviously coaching concepts in the individual, the odd exception. Invariably, it's unusual to see a very highly skilled player whose hand path and downswing would be underneath or behind or beneath or deeper than the path it goes back on. Now, this is when the audience goes, I could tell you 50 guys, and I'm sure you can. You're absolutely right. But you look at threads. What do most of the sample population do? And the good guys, invariably, that would be one of them.
And also, I think you mentioned one time the hands moving in the frontal plane, moving downwards. Like if you're looking at it from a face-on view, the start, you said you haven't seen too many hands move upwards in the start of the takeaway. No,
absolutely right. So you actually look at the hand and face on the hands moved up. It's unusual. I mean, to actually apply pressure, force to the hand, or the hands that literally have to push downwards. So you look at, to kind of give you numerical values now for you in the audience, a lot of the good guys that really kind of apply a lot of pressure to the handle, a lot of force to the handle, can put in inches or centimeters, Jason. Remind me, what do you like it in?
Inches.
About 2 or 3 inches, the hands can move down at start of backswing. So you take the origin, the middle of the lead hand in particular, the origin of the lead hand, it can kind of, as they kind of apply force and apply pressure to the handle at start of backswing, can kind of move down a good couple of inches.
Yeah, I've really paid attention to that since I heard you talk about that in one of your, I think it was one of your webinars.
Yeah. And why that's fantastic. So important. And why that's so important, that then really connects into things like the diaphragm and how the rib cage moves. So when you essentially kind of pull the handle upwards, that's a whole different way of then producing rotation, how you get activities kind of much more through the neck. That can then inflame and extend the rib cage, elevate the rib cage. The diaphragm can get disconnected from the pelvic floor, get really active at the back there. So often how the hands move in that initial phase in backswing really influences significantly then how the spine, rib cage, and pelvis move to produce rotation and force.
Yeah, no doubt.
Massively important.
So expand on the language, because I think this is important, especially for coaches out there, to get the correct language. And I can kind of tee you up anatomically, and also, in the words that students use a lot of times or relate to can be, not correct, I think. But we talk about like shoulder rotation, the pelvis, postural setup, shoulder plane versus sort of rib cage movement, and then the pelvis rotation instead of hip rotation. Like, talk a little bit about, because I think that's fascinating. It's something I think we need to all kind of get on board with as far as coaching in sort of explaining it in the correct language.
Yeah, I think you and I need to do a dictionary in that case, like a different the Oxford Dictionary, of golf, perhaps. And you could argue, why is it important? Well, it's important because a lot of the concepts younger players have come from what the word means to them.
Right.
So you could say, what difference it make calling it shoulder rotation? Well, a lot of what you have to pick through, maybe collegiate level in the US or national level in England, for example, is because of what that word meant to that player as a 13-year-old. Rotate the shoulders. So 8 years on, and they've got some pretty interesting kind of hand and arm movements because they perceive that as shoulder rotation. So it is important because a lot of what we have to resolve and navigate through at that level goes back to what the word meant to them. As I say, as a 13-year-old or 12-year-old kind of young lady, a young man way back when. So some examples being, shoulder rotation would be things like abduction or flexion extension. That would be, or medial lateral rotation is, say, that the TPIs at the 90-90 test, I think TPI do so well. That would be shoulder rotation. Actually, what rotates in golf is what's known as shoulder rotation is the spine, really. That's how the spine interacts with the thorax, with the neck. Obviously, the neck is the spine, but, using kind of more colloquial language now, in with the shoulders, in with the hands and wrists. So really what's producing rotation through backswing predominantly is how the spine is moving. So when you talk about spine rotation to, say a collegiate player, it's a very different concept that evokes than, say, shoulder rotation. why it becomes so important actually then goes into their training. That then, for me, connects into their training with, say, their physiotherapists, their S&C coaches, that okay, when I move my spine, I really feel more activity through things like those big obliques, the deep abdominal muscles, the TVAs, for example. I kind of really get that connection in and around that hip, that foot and ankle, around reaction force again. When you talk about shoulder rotation, they go, well, I kind of almost feel like I've decompressed some ways the pelvis, or I've kind of lost the connection through the foot. So often, again, the words we use in can really influence the concepts that we have. So that would be one for sure. Other ones you mentioned, kind of shoulder plane, you say, well, which one?
Because like if, when they say shoulder planes are too flat or too steep, mm-hmm. you reference more of the rib cage, right, and how that's affecting the look, right? So the
Absolutely.
2D look of what we're looking at. To expand on that, that was brilliant.
I could put my shoulders and scapula in some terrible positions, but it kind of looks like on camera, it's on plane as it would look like. So it should be really, well, what shoulder is one referring to? Is it the lead shoulder, trail shoulder? And it's only on that plane at that moment in time. So if you're looking at shoulder plane at top of back, so and halfway down, the shoulders have gone through tremendous ranges between those two positions. So it's only producing that plane, that instantaneous plane in some ways at that point in time there. So for me, it's much more how the scapula, the shoulder and the thorax interact to produce movement. So once again, you could have a really extended rib cage and a very flat shoulder plane. You could have a lot of flexion in the rib cage. Sorry, my mistake, the other way around. You could have a very extended rib cage and a very steep shoulder plane, because of how they've elevated the trail scap, they pushed that lead scap down and forward, they compressed. So really, but they've extended the rib cage simultaneously to produce that look. And then vice versa, you could have, say, a rib cage that's really being compressed, moving into lots of flexion in transition, but the lead scap starts to elevate, so the rib cage is moving downwards, but the shoulders look flat. So I think we're at the stage in life now. Most coaches, I think that the level of coach education is absolutely outstanding through things like, your podcast in particular, which is why I really enjoy listening to Scott in your sales spiel. And I was actually driving somewhere last week. I thought it was a great one to listen to that. I think the level of golf coaching education is remarkable now. I think we've got to look beyond now things like, shoulder rotation and shoulder planes and hip rotation. And it comes back to how good you want to be at this stuff. How good you want to be.
Right.
And do you know what good is? The enemy of great.
That's fair, yeah.
So that was by a guy called Jim Collins wrote that book. It's a famous author, a guy called Jim Collins wrote the book, Good's the Enemy of Great. And we need to look past now. So we've got to advance the definition why. You could argue because a lot of what we have to resolve at 21 is because of what it meant to them at 13. And I've experienced this and I've been blessed and long may continue for many years, that when you talk about how the spine moves, players move differently. Talk about what the pelvis does, people move differently. Talk about how the trail scapula interacts with the rib cage, people move differently. Then shoulder plane and shoulder rotation and is the short answer. No. We've got to move past that now. We've got to go past that now. We've got to go past that. Doesn't help.
All right. Yeah. So I know one of the things that going kind of down the list here, we said some of the best movers were doing was the rising of the pelvis through impact. I thought that was kind of interesting. Obviously, You can go deep into ground reaction forces and how they're moving their ankles and their feet and their legs. Is there anything else you've found like with the pelvis with good players? I know. This was kind of a cool thing too, as we talk, again, it's sort of teaching and thinking a little outside the box of how open the pelvis or how open the thorax needs to be at impact, and you really displayed a nice example of like a guy was hitting it farther and his pelvis was more closed or his thorax was more closed at impact than somebody that was more open. Have you found any correlation there? I'd love to hear your thoughts on speed. So I think it kind of ties in with that.
Yeah, that's a good one. That really goes back to essentially the shape of the human frame. They're called helical structures, helical angles. So the helix is Latin for spiral. So we are pretty much every single structure in the human body, bone, hair, tissue, is a spiral structure. So we are a spiral with spirals in many ways. So the shape of that helix will control really how a player rotates to produce force. So to give you a very short answer on this, because it's such a complex area, when you've got very narrow humans, so like me, narrow rib cage, narrow pelvis, the fascial, the tissue connections that run across the segments run a lot more vertically, because with narrow frames, they run up and down more. So the only real two movements you can make in life are what you call to expand and compress. You expand and you compress. So, for example, to rotate through back, so you externally rotate, which is expansion, and then you compress in downswing, which you then move back towards as you move into downswing. You get a much wider human. So, to give you an example, say, through observation, John Ram versus Justin Thomas.
Yeah, there you go. I was going to say, give us some.
So, John Ram,
figures.
He's a big boy, bless him, in a good way. He's a very powerful. He's a big ball in a great way.
Yeah.
And there's multiple reasons why that guy is just remarkable, and very wide human. So their tissue attachments run a lot more horizontally. So he will always get pulled more horizontally, and he will always change position more, certainly through backswing, than say a Justin Thomas, because as those tissues expand, they expand more horizontally. He gets pulled more. He'll get lifted up. He'll get kind of pushed away. As he rotates through backswing. Someone like Justin Thomas will stay a lot more kind of, call it center because it's easy, because it's an easy word to use.
Yeah.
But then in transition, it's very different. Someone like John Ram in transition, because again, the way he kind of produces rotation along those helical structures, he doesn't need to rotate as much or shift as much laterally as a narrow human does. So one reason why someone like Justin Thomas is really onto that lateral border of that lead foot, so up onto that big toe of the right foot, is because he has to move that way in downswing to create the same amount of downforce or compression, because his tissues run a lot more up and down than, say, a John Ram. So when you look at, say, how rotated people are at impact and how much their pelvis shifts at impact, it just comes back to, again, the shape of that frame. Wider humans, more horizontal tissue connections, they get pulled more side to side, they get pulled more up and down, forwards and backwards than the narrow guy, because he runs a lot more vertically.
That's interesting. I've never heard that before. That's crazy. So when somebody moves like against their body type like that, I'm assuming that could be a big problem.
Yeah, it's not advisable would be my response. I mean, it's not advisable. it's not an advisable approach to have. So again, they may go through life and long may this be the case with never an issue in life and be completely happy and good for them. It doesn't happen that often. It normally gets you at some point. It could be 25, 30, 35. It'll get you at some point because of just the nature of the sports, the game that we play. So I think for me, that's I'm actually presenting this. I'm hopefully looking forward to doing it in DC on Wednesday next week to a group of coaches around the helical frame, the helical structures, the spiral shapes that we have. Anatomically is the biggest reason why you'll get someone like John Ram doesn't need to rotate that much because of his frame shape. Justin Thomas has to shift his pelvis and move that way through foot and ankle because of his frame shape. So they would be two very good examples of players that have been very good at establishing how to best move for them around that shape of frame. Now, if you got both John Ram and Justin Thomas conforming to normative values, yeah, good luck.
You're gonna unskill them, right?
De-skill them, yeah. So that's what comes
de-skill them.
Comes back to once you've established the shape of the frame, then you can be a lot more guided as far as the approach you take to encourage someone to say, let's move away from this and just kind of encourage you to move more this way.
Interesting. Talk about what is a stretch shortening cycle. Can you describe that and what that is and how that's important?
Yeah, I mean, so within movement, that's called rebound or elastic recoil. So the idea of that kind of eccentric concentric action with the muscle that the tissues lengthen before they then shorten. So the X factor would be a good example. So what was known 20 years ago almost now, when the X factor was initially kind of discussed and discovered in the early 2000s, would be a good example of a stretch shortening cycle that exists between, as it was defined then, as the pelvis and the thorax. So that wonderful kind of elasticity, I call it rebound, the elastic recoil, the tissues lengthen then shorten to allow greater force physiologically to be produced through those tissues. So those stretch shortening cycles happen across every single paired segment in the body, foot to ankle, ankle to tib and fib, up into the femur, into the hip joint, the pelvis, through the lumbar spine. Lead shoulder adduction is a form of stretch shortening cycles. So even looking at the X factors as an example, is that when you look at separation, so true separation, you actually go back to the gait cycle again, which is why there's so many threads that we have within in this discussion, which is great. The gait cycle is possibly the best example we have within human movement of separation. So the gait separation typically happens in humans around about the diaphragm, 7th, 8th kind of rib vertebrae. So you look at someone from behind when they walk, they've got that wonderful kind of rotation, that separation, that kind of counter rotation phase happening kind of through that kind of that diaphragm kind of area. So there's a reason why the two best walkers that I know, DJ and Rory, is probably the two best movers, because they're the best walkers.
Interesting.
So when you look at, so again, it goes back to teeth and gait. So example for those at young babies, and it's a tough one. When you've got a young baby learning to walk, never hold their hand, you get the emotional connection, which is so important, obviously. We love that as parents. It's an absolute privilege. So you actually take away that wonderful contralateral gait of holding kids' hands, because they then learn to walk with just their kind of feet. They don't have that kind of opposite arm, opposite leg gait. So you look at kind of Rory and DJ walk, two of the best walkers. They've probably been the two best ball strikers in the last 10 years. I think most people will go, they're in the top 10. Rory and DJ, as kind of movers, because they walk so well. So when you actually look at separation is really of value above and below the diaphragm. So to expand on the X factor, which is like every good research, it's relevant at that point in time. And it's a huge value, of course it is, huge value. But as you evolve through life, it just becomes a lot more refined and more understood. True separation should be called pelvis lumbar spine upper thorax separation. How well can you separate upper thorax essentially above and below the diaphragm, which goes back to the trail shoulder again. How well can you kind of get that trail shoulder to separate, because the rib cage rotates away from that trail shoulder in transition, not increase external rotation, which goes back again to where 3D data gets used, I think, maybe in not the most helpful way. People start observing, or some people start seeing increases in external rotation in the trail shoulder, so they try and teach external rotation in the trail shoulder. Not really. The reality is the gait cycle creates separation above the diaphragm, which in golf really is. Can the lumbar spine, pelvis, diaphragm below that move away from the trail shoulder? That's what creates external rotation, not can you externally rotate your arm.
Wow. Yeah. So that's the magic. That's the magic bullet of transition, as we've talked about, is like so critical, right? I mean, it's one of the most important parts of the golf swing. How do you give us some of your drills or any tasks that you give your players, or maybe you've seen some of your favorite ones that you and your coaches have worked with to improve that? Because I mean, again, back to that trail arm, it's like, how do we get that trail arm to behave? How do we get the wrist angles to behave like we discussed? That's the big thing that we're kind of looking for. I'm always looking for better drills.
I might give you a very bad answer now, Jason, so I apologize in advance. If you and I did this 5 years ago, I'd probably give you 20 drills. I don't really use drills anymore, because I think if you need a drill, you don't fully understand the problem you're trying to solve.
Okay.
So I think drills are used because let's do a load of drills and kind of see if one helps. If you really understand the problem, or if the player fully understands the problem, done in that very intuitive ecological approach, they almost invariably move well. So I think a drill if someone needs a drill to encourage movement, they've missed the point in some ways.
So it goes back to that positional discussion then, right? So showing them where
you got it. That was my
be.
next point. If so static body postures, which is accepted within neuroscience of dance, players will almost go from A to B in that very intuitive way and move well. So if you give someone really defined references, static body postures, and they've got such a clear and precise, there's no ambiguity in any way around what they're trying to produce, unless there's a constraint anatomically, subtalar joint, femoral head, humeral head, whatever it might be. So allowing for all things being well anatomically, they almost always move us. It goes back to, like I said at the start of the discussion today, there's not a movement you can make in life when asked the right question. Drills are normally used too soon too early because you don't really understand fully what you're trying to solve. It's a bit like building software. The more time you spend at the front end, the less time you spend debugging at the back end. So I spend weeks and months with my developer planning the software to spend less time resolving issues at the back end. So I'm very big on this, and I actually learned this through Kevin Kirk, going back to Kevin again, that the slower you go, the quicker you get there, because you make less mistakes along the way. And I'm into that in a big way, that the slower you go on day one, so at the start of a session, let's just kind of slow down. Let's really look to why you move that way, where the expectations have come from, why you've had the observations you've had, why you've had the experiences you've had. Let's really start to explore that. Normally, when you fully understand that, you don't need a drill. So for me, drills are used, that's all aesthetics, that's very commercial, and I get that. But it really means you've kind of missed the problem. Because you hope if you try 3 drills, they may just connect with one, where you kind of fingers and toes crossed, please, let's kind of let one of these work. And so I've not used a drill I'd have to really sit and think. Honestly, when I used an actual drill last would be, I couldn't tell you when. It'd be some
older videos on your site, maybe. Before, like the Variban, the pivot exercise drill, I thought was pretty good.
Yeah, that's more body awareness. That's more static awareness, postural awareness.
Okay, well, you could call that a drill.
you can
I understand, though.
You can call it anything you want, but in a nice way.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think the last time I gave a drill, I think before my grey hairs came, so long time ago.
That kind of falls into the camp of your biofeedback belief.
I've not used biofeedback in a player. Oh wow! I mean, again, that is very much a dark room and a decaf coffee to figure out. When I used biofeedback last, couldn't tell you. Could not tell you.
Awesome.
Could not tell you when I used biofeedback to get sustainable development as a player. Couldn't tell you when I used biofeedback last.
Are there any other topics or anything I haven't asked you that we should discuss before we wrap? I really appreciate your time. This has been fantastic.
My pleasure. I've got to be up in 4 hours to get a flight, so we've done well to get this long, which is great. And I could talk to you. I could talk to you for hours, Jason. You asked such evocative questions and I really mean that. I really enjoyed speaking with you last time, and I guess that's more for your audience to ask, isn't it? Around. And they can always do that via, I guess, your social media and whatnot, as far as, and I love that. I mean, we've kind of lost that you can disagree and still be friends. And I think we've kind of lost that, which is a great shame. That most of my mates I kind of disagree with every day. That's why we're mates, because we can disagree in a friendly way. And
you do it in a loving way, right?
We've lost that. It's got so divisive these days. If you don't see it that way, then you're wrong. And no, I mean, part of being a mate is to say, I just don't see it that way, but let's discuss and figure out why. And so I'm sure there's a lot of things that you and I have said today that are really provocative, but in a very friendly, healthy, let's just have that nice discussion that really establish why we see it that way. And in many ways, I'll tell you one famous story just to kind of finish on. I think I did it just after you and I spoke in July last year now. And I said 10 because it was an easy tweet. It would have been probably 1,000. 10 things I've got wrong this year. I put on Instagram because I had a lot of conflict. I'm just, the guys aren't improving, and I'm not seeing the responses that maybe the E would expect. Let me look at this. I really explored some areas and figured out there was 10 things 10 main things that I really got badly wrong recently. And I acknowledge this publicly. In the abuse I received was staggering. You can't say this, and how can you acknowledge you're wrong? And I think you've clearly missed the point of the message. I'm just saying, look, we all need to introspect, just reflect on, is actually what we're doing helping? It's not about me, it's not about the ego. Is that really helping those players evolve? And I said there's 10 things in particular that I just don't see as being helpful that I did a year ago. So a lot of guys saw it in the way it's meant to come across, but we all need to look at what we do and go, has the cure become the disease again? And some people are really deeply offended by that I could acknowledge publicly that I'm wrong. I said, look, I kind of take the approach, even a broken watch is correct twice a day. Doesn't matter. You're going to be right twice a day. And right. I acknowledge I'm wrong 30 days of most months. But when you get that one day when you, you're close to being somewhere near the truth, and that's a very cool day to have. That's a really neat day.
Yeah, and that's when learning happens. I think when, like you said, that's you're curious, you question even your own information. I mean, I think that's the brilliance in what you do and the person that you are. That's
why even the word practice is such a bad word. What do you want to? You look at what practice means. It means to reinforce what you currently know. It should be called, what do you want to learn today? So I know in the US they call it the practice tea. It should be called the learning tea, not the practice tea. What do you want to learn today rather than what do you want to practice today? It completely frames the session differently. What moves you'd like to learn or what moves you'd like to practice. So one says about let's reinforce what you currently do, which is the dark side of movement. You just invariably reinforce poor movement. The other one's about how can you really expand and evolve, which is what movements would you like to learn today? So to kind of leave you on kind of a good one, contemporary dancers, again, typically learn about 400 new moves a week. How many movements do golfers learn a week? They find one a challenge.
Yeah, I was going to say that mindset goes right through the roof, doesn't it?
Yeah, dancers, 400.
You give them two things, you're like, this is way too much.
Yeah, so you try and shift them in one direction. It's complete kind of devastation for some, but these really established advanced movers, they can learn up to 400 movements a week, which is why the plasticity in their brain is so good.
Fascinating. Well, I won't keep you up any longer, sir. Thank you so much for your time.
I could talk until I could go straight to the airport and a good way from here, but I think my friends in Glasgow, the next few days might be a little bit disappointing.
Yeah, you need to get some sleep there, my man. But thanks again for coming on, and thanks for everything you're doing for our industry and pushing us to new levels, because I know you've helped me a tremendous amount, and I'm sure I speak for a lot of people. I'll put in the intro how they can find you. You're not that hard to find, so everybody can send Doc a question on Instagram or
always welcome.
Contribute and definitely subscribe to his site, because it's by far the best, I think, 3D just coaching and teaching site out there. So do yourself a favor, and I always push people towards that. So I think you're doing well in that respect. Keep putting out that great content and being what do you call it? Shinshu?
Shinshu, like the beginner's mindset. The beginner's mindset.
Be the beginner and always have that mindset, and I think we're all going to get better.
Never be the bright guy. Always be the dummy in the room. Never be the bright guy in the room. So always be the dummy. And Jason, thank you so much for thinking of me and inviting me back again. And let's hope it's not another 13 months, whatever it is, before you and I speak again. And I love your questions. I love the energy you give. And like I said, it was great to listen to the podcast you did with Scott a few weeks ago, because I just in my car and I thought great, and I really enjoyed what you did. So I'm a big fan. So thank you so much for everything you do as well.
Well, you're very kind to say that, and we're definitely going to do this again in person, because I definitely want to work with you at some point, and we just need to make that happen. So
my pleasure.
All right, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much again. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Jason.
Absolutely. What's up, everybody? Guru back here again with a couple of things before you jump off. First, big thank you to Scott for coming on the show and sharing some incredible knowledge and information that I know will help all of you coaches out there to help your players. Make sure you reach out to Doc on Instagram at Dr. S.K. Lynn, and on the Twitter at ScottKLynn_PhD, and give him a social wave or shoot him a question, because he's really open to share all of his great information. You can follow me on Twitter if you're not already. What is going on out there? I'm at Golf Guru TV on Twitter and Instagram. Shoot me a DM if you have any questions or any comments about the show or just anything in general. Happy to get back to you as soon as I can. Also, check out my website at golfgurutv.net, where you can find videos, articles, and more information on my teaching and coaching. There's such cool stuff there if you dig deep enough. I've got old Guru workshop videos of top coaches doing presentations. I've got articles, all kinds of cool stuff to dig into. So please follow me on my site. If you have any questions or comment about the show, you can email the show at golfgurushow@gmail.com, or like I said, hit me up on the DM on any of the aforementioned platforms. The show and all episodes of the Golf Guru Show were produced by myself, Jason Sutton. Music is by Zach Mullet, aka Cutta Beats. Leave me an iTunes review or a rating. That also helps me big time in my ratings on iTunes, and again, helping me continue to bring you this awesome content. And as I always leave with you, my mantra: study, practice, teach, and then pass it on. I'll talk to you later. Thanks so much for listening.